The rain had been falling sideways for 3 hours by the time Diana Reyes turned onto Westheimer Road, and Houston had stopped pretending it could handle it. The streets were rivers now. Trash cans floated past stop signs. Traffic lights swayed and flickered, like they were reconsidering their life choices. Diana had her wipers on full blast, and they still couldn't keep up. Every few seconds, the windshield went completely opaque before the blades dragged it clear again. She checked her phone. 1 delivery left. Chicken fried rice and 2 egg rolls 6 blocks ahead. $14 and whatever tip the guy felt like leaving on a night like this. She'd been doing this for 4 years, driving for delivery apps, picking up bar shifts on weekends, and she knew bad weather always brought bad tippers. But rent was due Friday, and Elijah's medication wasn't going to pay for itself, so she kept driving. That's when she saw it. The Mercedes came from the service road to her left, moving way too fast. It jumped the curb, clipped a fire hydrant that sent a geyser straight up into the storm, and went nose first into the drainage channel running alongside the road. Not a ditch, a channel, 8 feet deep, already running hard with 3 hours of storm runoff. Diana had her door open before she fully understood what she was doing. There was no calculation. There was just a car going under and a person inside it, and her feet were already in the water before her brain caught up. The cold hit like a wall, not the gasping kind, the locking up kind, the kind that reaches through your clothes and grabs at your bones. She pushed through it anyway, half wading toward the car, which had tilted sharply, the driver's window already submerged to the door handle. She could see him through the glass. Older man, silver-haired, dark suit, one hand pressed flat against the window. Conscious barely, water already at his chest. She grabbed the door handle. Nothing. The pressure held it sealed. She spotted a chunk of broken concrete on the bank, drove it into the corner of the window 3 times until the glass gave, reached through, found his arm pulled. He was heavier than he looked. Dead weight, one hand fumbling weakly at the doorframe. She braced her feet and pulled again. And this time, he came loose, both of them, tumbling backward into the current before Diana got her footing and hauled them onto the bank. She checked him the way she'd learned in a free first aid class she'd taken 2 years ago, back when she was trying to be ready for anything Elijah might need. Breathing shallow and fast, but breathing. A deep gash above his left eyebrow was sending dark streaks down through the rain on his face. Eyes open but unfocused, moving slow. Diana pressed her folded jacket against the cut and called 911. Units are delayed, the dispatcher told her. Multiple incidents across the city. Best estimate, 6 to 8 minutes. She kept her voice even and stayed on the line. That's when she noticed it. The man's jacket had come open when she pulled him out, and something had slipped from the inside breast pocket. A small USB drive, bright red, lying in the wet grass about 2 feet away. A strip of black electrical tape across the top. A sequence of numbers written in fine point marker. She picked it up, turned it over once, and tucked it into her front jeans pocket. She'd give it back when he could tell her his name. The ambulance arrived in just under 7 minutes. 2 paramedics, calm and efficient, taking over with the ease of people who had seen far worse on far worse nights. They stabilized him, loaded him onto the stretcher, and as they wheeled him toward the ambulance, he turned his head and found her face in the dark. His lips moved 2 words too quiet to hear it blow over the rain, and then the doors closed. Diana stood on the sidewalk, soaking wet, her jacket, gone her last delivery, order sitting waterlogged in her car. She should get back in. She should drive home. Elijah had been at her neighbor's place for 11 hours now. Instead, she stood there, one hand pressed against her front pocket, where the small red drive was sitting, and stared at the drainage channel. The Mercedes was almost completely gone, just the roof still visible, its hazard lights blinking orange, beneath 3 feet of moving water, like a mechanical heartbeat that didn't know yet it was over. That's when the prickling started at the back of her neck, the kind that had nothing to do with the cold. She turned around. Across the 4 lanes of Westheimer, standing perfectly still on the opposite sidewalk, was a man in a dark, rain jacket. Not running for cover, not looking at the accident scene. Just standing there, in the downpour, his face turned directly toward her, with the calm, focused stillness of someone who had been watching for a while and saw no reason to stop. The ambulance siren faded down the block. The street went quiet except for the rain. Then the man raised his phone to his ear, eyes never leaving her face, and made a call. The storm had blown itself out somewhere around 4 in the morning. By the time Diana pushed through the front entrance of Texas Children's Hospital at 8:30, Houston looked like it had been wrung out and left to dry, puddles the size of parking lots, broken branches against fences, the sky that particular washed-out blue that only shows up after a hard rain. She had the route to his room memorized. 4th floor, left out of the elevator, past the nurse's station, with the paper butterflies on the window, a 3rd door on the right. She'd walked it so many times over the past 14 months, it lived in her feet more than her head. She heard him before she saw him. I made it extra detailed this time. See the little lines? Those are supposed to be the valves. Elijah, 6 years old, small for his age, with Diana's same dark eyes and a smile he used like a secret weapon, was sitting up in bed with a piece of printer paper propped against his knees and a red crayon in his hand. He was explaining the drawing to his morning nurse with the focused seriousness of someone delivering a medical lecture. The drawing was a heart, not the Valentine's kind. Elijah had strong feelings about anatomical accuracy. 4 chambers, several carefully rendered valves, arrows, showing the direction everything was supposed to flow. His hand was shaking slightly as he drew. Not enough to send the crayon skidding, just a faint, persistent tremor that Diana caught the way mothers catch things in the peripheral vision of the heart. Mama, he looked up and the smile landed straight in her chest. I drew our hearts, mine and yours. Yours is the big one. She crossed the room, kissed the top of his head, sat down. The paper bag she'd brought, blueberry muffin, chocolate milk, his standing request without exception. This was the thing about Elijah that got her every time. He never complained, not about the needles, the monitoring, the weeks spent in this room while other kids were outside. He just drew his anatomical hearts and made sure Diana ate something whenever she visited, because somewhere along the way, he'd decided that worrying about her was his job. He'd been born with a condition where one side of his heart hadn't developed properly. A situation that required not one surgery, but a series of them, each buying more time, each leaving its own quiet mark. The procedure that could actually address the root of it required a compatible donor. And compatible donors for a 6-year-old with his specific profile didn't arrive on any predictable schedule. Dr. Marcus Webb knocked at 9:15. He was Elijah's primary cardiologist. Steady measured the kind of calm that Diana had initially found reassuring and had slowly learned to read more carefully. She'd gotten good at watching his eyes, because his mouth and his eyes didn't always say the same thing. They stepped into the hallway. Diana kept Elijah in her sightline through the window. His numbers from last night trended lower, Webb said. Nothing urgent, but it's consistent over the past 3 weeks. He's working harder than he should be. What does that mean for the timeline? His current position on the donor list is 312. A pause. At the current rate of compatible donors in this region, we're looking at 3 to 4 months. Is there a way to accelerate it? Expand the search radius. Flag the file for urgent review. Something moved across Webb's face. Fast, barely they're gone, before she could name it. He looked down at his clipboard and adjusted it slightly. A small, unnecessary gesture. There are standard escalation protocols, he said. I'll make sure everything on our end is properly documented. A non-answer. Diana had been the mother of a sick child long enough to know the difference between a doctor without information and a doctor choosing what to share. Webb was doing the second thing. She just didn't know why yet. I'd like to go over the escalation options in detail, she said. Can we schedule something this week? Of course. He made a note without meeting her eyes, said goodbye to Elijah through the window with a small wave, and headed down the hall at a pace that was just slightly too deliberate to be casual. Diana watched him go, filed it away, and went back inside. Elijah held up the finished drawing. I made yours bigger, he said. Because yours has to hold more. It has to hold me too. She took it from him carefully. 2 hearts side by side, one large, one small, with shaking red lines showing where everything was supposed to flow. She was still looking at it when her phone buzzed. "Unknown number," she answered. "Miss Reyes." The voice was flat, deliberate, emptied of anything identifiable, no accent, no warmth, no wasted words. "You're holding something that doesn't belong to you. Return it, and don't ask why." The line went dead. Diana stood in the middle of her son's hospital room, his drawing in one hand and her phone in the other, while Elijah reached for a fresh crayon and told her which color he was going to use next. Across town, in a room that looked nothing like any other room in any other hospital in Houston, a different kind of mourning was underway. Memorial, Herman's private wing on the 7th floor, existed in a separate category from the rest of the building, the kind of category that didn't advertise itself. No handmade paper butterflies on the windows here. No communal waiting areas with plastic chairs and vending machines humming in the corner. Just wide, quiet hallways, rooms with actual furniture, and a level of attentive service that had more in common with a boutique hotel than a medical facility. Raymond Cole had been a patient on this floor twice before. He knew what the thread count on the sheets felt like. He knew the name of the woman who ran the floor's private nursing staff. He had at various points over the past decade donated enough money to this hospital that his name appeared on a small brass plaque near the elevator, the kind of plaque that announces, without saying it directly, that certain people exist on a different set of terms than everyone else. He opened his eyes at 9:47 in the morning, registered the ceiling, registered the IV line in his left arm, registered the faint throbbing above his left eye, where they'd closed the gash with 8 stitches while he was unconscious, and said, without preamble, to the man sitting in the chair beside his bed, "The drive. Where is it?" Victor Reese, Raymond's personal assistant, for 11 years, a composed man in his early 40s, who had managed Raymond's schedule, his correspondence, and the considerable logistics of his private life, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that anticipating problems was preferable to reacting to them, looked up from his phone. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. The doctors would like to—" "Victor." Raymond's voice was flat, still rough from whatever they'd given him to keep him under while they worked on his head, but flat in the way that meant the conversation had already been decided. "The drive." Victor set his phone face down on his knee. "We retrieved your wallet and your phone from the scene. Your jacket was too damaged. The inside pocket—" He paused. "We didn't find it." The room was very quiet for a moment. Raymond's right hand, resting on top of the sheet, moved slowly to the edge of the mattress and closed around the bedrail. Not dramatically, not visibly, to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Just a quiet, controlled tightening, the kind of grip you use when you need something solid to hold on to, while you keep your face completely still. "Someone pulled me out," he said. "Yes, a woman. She called 911 and waited with you until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics noted she'd applied pressure to your head wound with her own jacket." Raymond processed this in silence. Outside the window, Houston was beginning its slow, post-storm recovery work crews. On the streets, helicopters, doing aerial assessments. The particular organized chaos of a city that had been through this before and knew the drill. "Her name," he said. "We're working on that." The door opened. The man who came in was not a doctor. Raymond had known enough doctors to recognize the difference in how they carried themselves. This man wore a well-cut suit and the particular expression of someone accustomed to delivering carefully managed information. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he had been on retainer with Raymond's holding company for going on 9 years. He pulled a chair close to the bed, leaned in, and spoke quietly for about 90 seconds. Raymond listened without interrupting, which was itself a kind of answer. Raymond Cole interrupted people constantly, as a rule, because he processed faster than most people spoke and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. When he went quiet and still and let someone finish it, meant the information required his full attention. Gerald finished. Raymond looked at the ceiling for a moment. What Gerald had described the situation With the drive, the people who wanted it back, the particular urgency of the timeline was not a surprise. Raymond had known for several weeks that things were moving toward some kind of reckoning. He had not anticipated the car going into a drainage channel on a Tuesday night in a rainstorm. He had not anticipated someone pulling him out. He had not anticipated the drive ending up somewhere he couldn't immediately retrieve it. There was a moment, brief, and Raymond did not permit it to last, where something that might have been a different kind of thought tried to surface. A woman had gone into floodwater for a stranger, without knowing who he was, without any reason except that he was there and he needed help. He pushed the thought back down. He could not afford it right now. "Find her," he said. "We have her vehicle's plates from the scene," Gerald said. "It shouldn't take long." Raymond nodded once. He looked down at his right hand, still wrapped around the bed rail, and released it deliberately, finger by finger, until his hand was resting flat on the mattress again. The drive contained things that could not be explained away. Signed documents, dated correspondence, records of arrangements that had seemed at the time like pragmatic decisions made by a pragmatic man in a complicated industry. He had told himself, when he made those arrangements, that the alternative was worse, that the system was already broken, that he was simply operating within the reality that existed, rather than the one that should. He had told himself a lot of things. "When you find her," he said, "I need to know before anyone else does." He looked at Gerald directly. "And make sure she doesn't reach anyone in any official capacity before we've had a chance to speak with her." Gerald gave a small nod and stood. Raymond turned back to the window. Down on the street, a crew was clearing debris from the night before branches displaced signage, the ordinary wreckage of a storm that had already moved on to somewhere else. The city cleaned up after itself. It always did. "Mr. Cole," Victor's voice quiet. "Should I contact Dr. Reeves about your discharge timeline?" "Tomorrow," Raymond said. He hadn't looked away from the window. "Handle what needs handling first." Victor left. Gerald left. The room went quiet again. Raymond Cole lay in his 700 thread count sheets in his private room on the 7th floor and thought about a small red drive in the hands of a woman whose name he didn't yet know, and what it would cost him if she figured out what was on it before he found her. The answer to that question had no number he was willing to accept. Some decisions announce themselves. They come with weight and ceremony, with a moment of stillness before you make them, that lets you know something is about to change. Others just happen. You're sitting at your kitchen table at 2 a.m, and your hand is moving before your brain has finished the argument, and by the time you've thought it all the way through, it's already done. Diana had been staring at the USB drive for 40 minutes. It sat in the middle of her kitchen table, that small red rectangle with the strip of electrical tape and the handwritten numbers catching the light from the overhead bulb. The way an ordinary object catches light, because it was an ordinary object. A thumb drive, the kind you could buy in a 3-pack at any drugstore. Except that someone had called her this morning, in a voice scraped clean of every human quality, and told her to give it back without asking why, and that same someone or someone connected to them had been standing across 4 lanes of rain-soaked road, watching her face while she stood next to an ambulance. She picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. Her laptop sat open on the table, the screen dim from inactivity, the cursor blinking in the password field, like it was waiting patiently for her to make up her mind. The apartment was quiet, the way only late-night apartments are quiet. Rosa's television murmuring through the shared wall. The refrigerator cycling on and off, the distant hiss of a car moving through standing water on the street below. Elijah was asleep in the next room. She could hear his breathing through the cracked door. That particular rhythm she'd memorized the way some people memorize songs. She plugged the drive in. The laptop recognized it immediately. A window opened. One folder, no label. She clicked it. Every file inside was encrypted gray icons with lock symbols, no previews, no readable content. 18 files total, named with the same format, a code, a date, range, a file extension she didn't recognize. She couldn't open any of them. She couldn't see what was inside, except for the folder name itself. It sat at the top of the window, in plain, unencrypted text, the way a label on a box tells you what's inside without opening it. TXCH. List. Manipulation. 2019. 2023.ENC. Diana read it twice, then a third time, slowly making sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. TXCH. Texas Children's Hospital. List manipulation. 4 years. She sat back in her chair. The refrigerator cycled off, and the apartment went even quieter than before. She looked at the folder name on the screen and thought about a number. 312. The number Webb had given her that morning in the hallway outside Elijah's room, in the careful, measured tone of a man delivering information he had pre-approved for delivery. Position 312, on a list that someone had apparently been manipulating for 4 years. She took a screenshot, then another from a slightly different angle, making sure the folder name was legible in both. She saved them to a separate folder on her desktop, then forwarded them to her own email address as a backup. 30 seconds of work. She'd learned early in life that the things worth keeping needed to exist in more than one place. She ejected the drive, pulled it from the port, and held it in her closed fist for a moment. Then she got up, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, where she kept the box of rice she never cooked and the birthday candles left over from Elijah's last party, reached behind them, and placed the drive in the back corner where neither item had been touched in months. She was still standing on her tiptoes, with her hand in the cabinet, when her phone lit up on the table. She came down slowly and looked at it without touching it. A text message. Unknown number, different from the one that had called her this morning, but carrying the same quality of deliberateness, the same sense of a message that had been composed by someone who chose each word the way you choose a tool. 4 words. We know you plugged it in. Diana stood in her kitchen and did not move for a long moment. The sound of Elijah breathing came through the cracked bedroom door, steady and slow, the rhythm of a child who trusted completely that the world would still be in order when he woke up. She walked to the window above the sink and looked down at the street. The black sedan was parked directly across from her building. Engine running, she could see the faint shimmer of exhaust rising from the tailpipe in the cool night air. Lights off. It had been there long enough that the tires had settled into the shallow puddle at the curb, leaving still water on both sides. It wasn't moving. It wasn't leaving. It was just there, the way a fact is just there, waiting to be acknowledged. Diana stood at the window for a long time, looking down at the car and thinking with the particular clarity that comes at 2 a.m. when there's no noise left to hide behind. She had a folder name and 2 screenshots, and a drive she couldn't read, and people who very much wanted it back, and a son on a waiting list that someone had been quietly rearranging for 4 years. She had a phone she no longer trusted, and an apartment she was no longer sure was private, and exactly 0 people in her immediate circle who had any access to the kind of information she needed. Except one. She thought about the hallway outside Elijah's room, the small, unnecessary adjustment of the clipboard, the eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers when she asked about escalation options, the pace of a man walking away from a conversation he'd wanted to end before it started. Webb knew something. She had been certain of it since 9:15 that morning, and she was more certain of it now. He was the only thread she had that connected her world to whatever was inside that encrypted folder, the only person with both the access and the obvious discomfort of someone carrying a weight he hadn't chosen and couldn't put down. She didn't know yet what he knew or how deep it went or whether he'd talk to her if she pushed, but she knew that the car outside wasn't going to wait forever, and neither was Elijah. She hadn't slept. There hadn't been much point in trying. By 5:30, Diana was already dressed, already moving her screenshots saved to 2 separate places, and the decision she'd made at the kitchen window fully set by the time she locked her apartment door behind her. Rosa had agreed without question, and without needing much explanation, to stay with Elijah until he woke up. That was the thing about Rosa. She understood that some mornings required getting somewhere before the rest of the world caught up. The hospital corridors at 6 a.m. had their own particular quality. Quieter than the day, busier than the night, populated by the in-between people. The early staff, the overnight families who hadn't gone home, the cleaning crews pushing their carts through the long fluorescent hallways with the practiced efficiency of people who preferred the building before it filled up. Diana moved through all of it without stopping, took the elevator to the 4th floor, turned left, and stood in front of the door marked Dr. M. Webb, attending cardiologist. She knocked twice. A long pause. Then the sound of a chair moving. The man who opened the door looked like he'd been at his desk since before she arrived, which he probably had, but he also looked like the night before had not been restful. Webb was still in his coat, his badge slightly crooked, a half-finished cup of coffee on the desk behind him going cold. When he saw Diana standing in the hallway, something moved through his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the particular look of a man who had been waiting for a knock he'd hoped wouldn't come. Ms. Reyes. His voice was careful. It's early. Is Elijah? He's fine. She kept her voice level. This isn't about his numbers. She held up her phone. The screenshot filled the screen, the folder name sharp and legible, every word exactly where it needed to be. Webb looked at it. The color left his face, the way water leaves a glass when it tips quickly, completely, all at once. Can I come in? Diana said. And it wasn't really a question. He stepped back. She closed the door behind her. He didn't sit down. Neither did she. They stood on opposite sides of his desk, in the quiet of an early morning office, and Webb looked at the photograph on her phone for a long moment before he looked away. And when he looked away, it was toward the window. And when he looked at the window, he wasn't seeing the view. How long have you had it? He asked. Since the night of the storm. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already worked out. They called you, Diana said. It wasn't a question either. They've been calling me for 14 months. His voice had gone flat, in a way that had nothing to do with composure, the flatness of someone who had rehearsed what they'd say in this moment, and found now that it was here that the rehearsal hadn't helped. Every time your son's file came up for review, every time there was a chance to move him. I got a call, and He stopped. You delayed it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They mentioned your daughter, Diana said. The muscles in Webb's jaw tightened. Just once. She's a sophomore at Rice. Pre-med. A pause. They know her class schedule. The room was very quiet. Diana thought about 14 months of watching her son's numbers and asking careful questions and getting carefully managed answers. She thought about every appointment where Webb had been just slightly too controlled, just slightly too deliberate, carrying something she couldn't see. Who are they? She asked. I don't know all of it. I know there's a group of families, wealthy connected, who have been paying for priority placement. I know the arrangements go back at least 4 years. I know there are people above me in this who are not doctors. He finally turned from the window and looked at her directly, the look of a man who had stopped managing what his face was doing. I am so sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I understand what I did. I understand what it cost. Diana looked at him for a long moment. It almost cost him everything, she said quietly. Webb had no answer for that. There wasn't one. 3 floors below, and on the other side of the building, Raymond Cole came through the main entrance of Texas Children's Hospital for the first time in 3 years. He'd discharged himself from Memorial Hermann that morning over the mild objections of his attending physician, put on the fresh clothes Victor had brought, and taken a car across town. No assistant this time, no lawyer, just Raymond in a dark coat moving through the hospital lobby, like a man who was trying to be unremarkable, and not entirely succeeding, because Raymond Cole had spent 40 years in rooms where people noticed who walked in, and the habit of presence was not easily set aside. He passed the donor wall near the main corridor. His name was there, in the stone, Raymond Cole, carved in the same clean serif font as everyone else, part of a list of contributors that stretched across 12 feet of granite. He had walked past it a dozen times over the years. He had never once had trouble meeting it. This morning he looked at the carpet instead. The fourth-floor waiting area was half full, with the early population of a children's hospital, parents in yesterday's clothes, grandparents with coffee cups, the specific, exhausted alertness of people keeping vigil. Raymond stood at the entrance to the waiting area and scanned it until he found her. She was by the window, dark jacket hair pulled back, the posture of someone who had been awake too long and was running on something harder than sleep. He wouldn't have recognized her from the night of the storm. It had been too dark, he had been too far under. But Victor had sent him a photograph pulled from the delivery company's driver records, and he knew her face now. He crossed the room and sat down in the empty chair beside her. She turned, registered him as a stranger, started to look away. "My name is Raymond Cole," he said. "You pulled me out of my car 2 nights ago." She looked at him properly, then. Something shifted in her expression, recognition assembling itself piece by piece. "You were in that car," she said. "I was. You're okay." 8 stitches. "I've had worse." He paused. "I wanted to thank you. What you did was, you're here to get it back." Her voice had gone flat and direct, the warmth entirely gone. "Aren't you?" Raymond opened his mouth, closed it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 5. Long enough to answer the question without answering it. Diana stood up and picked up her jacket from the chair. "Miss Reyes." He kept his voice even. "I understand why you're—" She was already moving, 3 steps toward the door, her shoulders set with the particular determination of someone done with a conversation. "Your son." Raymond said it quietly, but clearly, to her back. "Position 312 on the donor list. He's there because of me." Diana stopped. She didn't turn around. She didn't take another step forward. She just stood there in the middle of the waiting room, perfectly still, with her back to him and the exit 10 feet in front of her. The waiting room on the 4th floor had its own rhythm by mid-afternoon, the muted television cycling through local news, the vending machine humming its single note in the hallway, families rotating in and out with the quiet persistence of people for whom visiting hours had long since stopped being a rule. Diana had been sitting by the window for 20 minutes when she noticed the woman in the corner. Blonde, mid-30s, holding a paper coffee cup in both hands, the way you hold something when you need your hands occupied rather than because you intend to drink it. The cup had gone cold. Diana could tell from the way the woman wasn't sipping, just gripping her eyes on the middle distance, with the unfocused steadiness of someone who had been in this room long enough to stop seeing it. What caught Diana's attention was the sweater, pale blue cable knit, small embroidered detail at the cuffs. She had specifically commented on it 8 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon in this exact waiting room. "Nice sweater." The woman had smiled and said thank you. It was her mother's, and they had sat together for 2 hours that afternoon, talking the way people talk when they're both waiting for news they're afraid of carefully at first, then not carefully at all. Diana crossed the room and sat down beside her. Sarah Whitmore looked up, and the recognition was immediate, warm and tired in equal measure. "How's your boy?" Diana asked. A brief tightening, then a deliberate softening. "Still waiting." "Yours?" "Still waiting." They sat with that for a moment, the way you can only sit with certain things, alongside someone who already understands them. Sarah's son, Tyler, was 7, sandy-haired, obsessed with taking things apart to see how they worked and putting them back together better. He'd been on the transplant list for 11 months. Sarah had told Diana all of this the first time they met, and Diana had told Sarah about Elijah, and somewhere in those 2 hours, they'd become the particular kind of friends that only exist in hospital waiting rooms. "He had a rough week," Sarah said, looking at her cup. "Lower energy, sleeping more." She paused. "The doctors say it's expected, but—" The word hung there, finishing itself. "I know," Diana said. "He asked me yesterday why he has to be patient." Sarah's voice was quiet, but steady. "His friend at school doesn't have to be patient about anything. He just gets to do things." She almost smiled. "I told him patience was a superpower. He said he'd rather have flying." Diana laughed, the kind that lives right next to something heavier. She told Sarah about Elijah's latest drawing, the 2 hearts, the careful valves, the arrows. Sarah listened the way good listeners do, her expression moving with the story. "He sounds extraordinary," Sarah said. "They both are." Sarah reached over and covered Diana's hand with hers. No words, just the warm, steady pressure of one person reminding another they weren't carrying it alone. Diana turned her hand over and held on. Two mothers in a fourth-floor waiting room, each tethered to a room down the hall, where someone small and irreplaceable was doing the hard work of waiting alongside them. "I pray every night," Sarah said softly, "that there'll be enough hearts for both of them, that nobody has to wait for someone else to get their turn." Diana squeezed her hand. It was the most honest sentence she'd heard all day. Her phone buzzed. Raymond Cole. She hadn't saved his number. She hadn't given him hers either, which meant he'd found it the same way he'd found everything else. That reminder sat unpleasantly in her chest as she opened the message. 4 lines, short and precise. A compatible donor identified in Dallas. Blood type O, positive. Preliminary match confirmed this afternoon. Compatibility confirmed with 2 active recipients at this facility. Diana read it twice. O positive. 2 recipients. She opened the hospital's patient portal and pulled up Elijah's profile. His blood type at the top of the file, same as always. O positive. Her eyes moved back to Raymond's message. 2 recipients. She found the second line she'd skimmed past. Current list positions of matched recipients. 3, 12, and 47. The room went very quiet. She knew 312. She'd been carrying that number since yesterday morning. She didn't know 47. She'd never had reason to. But Sarah had mentioned Tyler's position once, months ago. In the offhand way, you mention something you've memorized without meaning to. Diana looked up slowly. Sarah was facing forward, eyes closed, lips moving in the quiet, private way of someone mid-prayer. The pale blue sweater, the cold coffee cup still in her free hand, her fingers still laced through Diana's. 1 heart, 2 boys. One of them would wait. The clock on the waiting room wall read 7:03 when Diana stood up. She'd been sitting with the information for 90 minutes, long enough to turn it over from every angle, long enough to exhaust the version of herself that wanted to sit still and think her way through it, long enough to arrive at the only conclusion that mattered. 12 hours was the standard window for a donor organ once it had been matched and cleared. 12 hours from confirmation to placement. After that, the match expired and the process started over, and the next compatible donor for a 6-year-old with Elijah's profile was not something anyone could put a date on. She found Webb on the 2nd floor, coming out of a consultation room with a tablet under his arm and the look of a man at the tail end of a long shift. "I need 5 minutes," she said. He glanced down the hallway in both directions, a reflex she'd noticed that had become automatic for him, and nodded her toward an empty family consultation room near the stairwell. She closed the door. She didn't sit down. "There's a compatible donor in Dallas," she said. "O positive, matched to Elijah's profile. The window closes in under 12 hours. She watched his face. "I need you to flag his file for urgent review. Push for an emergency escalation. You're his attending physician. You have the authority to initiate that process." Webb set his tablet on the table slowly, the way you set something down when you're buying yourself 3 seconds to think. "Diana," his voice was careful, "I explained this morning what my situation is. The people who've been contacting me, they're not going to stop because I decide to push an escalation request. If anything, that kind of move would... I'm not asking you to expose anyone. I'm asking you to do your job. It's not that simple. He has 12 hours. She kept her voice level because raising it would not help, and she knew it. His name is Elijah. He's 6 years old, and he draws anatomical hearts with a red crayon, and he's been waiting 14 months. So I need to know, is there anything you can do right now within the system to move his file forward legitimately?" Webb was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the calculation, the fear, the thing underneath, the fear that was older and heavier. "No," he said finally. "Not without triggering a review that would take longer than 12 hours to process. The escalation pathway requires sign-off from 2 department heads and a committee review, minimum 48 hours. He looked at her steadily, and for once his eyes and his voice were saying the same thing. I'm sorry. I mean that. But I cannot manufacture a shortcut that doesn't exist. Oh, Diana stood there for a moment. Then she picked up her jacket from the chair, said nothing, and walked out. Raymond was in the hospital's ground floor cafe. A corner table facing the door, a cup of coffee he hadn't touched going cold in front of him. He'd been waiting. She could tell from the way he wasn't surprised when she sat down across from him, the way a man isn't surprised by something he's already calculated. Webb can't help, she said. No preamble. What can you actually do? Raymond turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. I can make calls. I have relationships with people on the hospital's oversight board with the Regional Transplant Authority. But, he paused, using that kind of influence to move a specific name up a list, even legitimately, without documented justification, creates a paper trail that points directly at interference. Given what's already on that drive, any move I make that looks like list manipulation, even in Elijah's favor, becomes evidence against him and against the process. So you can't help either. Not that way. The only move that actually works, the only one that holds, is if the existing manipulation is exposed through proper channels. If the Oversight Board receives the documented evidence and orders a full audit, every position on that list gets reviewed simultaneously. Elijah's legitimate placement gets established on record. The match gets processed correctly. He met her eyes. But that process takes time. We may not have tonight. Diana looked at the table. 12 hours, minus the time she'd already spent. She thought about Elijah in his room upstairs, probably asleep, now his new drawing folded on the tray table beside him. She thought about Sarah in the waiting room with her cold coffee and her closed eyes and her quiet prayer. She thought about the fact that she was sitting across from the man who had put her son at position 312 and asking him what to do about it, and how completely insane that was, and how it was also just the situation. Her phone rang. Webb, she answered. Ms. Reyes. His voice was different, stripped of the careful management she'd gotten used to, lower and more direct. I need to tell you something. And after I do, you can turn me in. I mean that you can walk straight to hospital administration, and I won't contest a word of it. A breath. But first, you need to know the truth about that heart. Diana stood up from the table and walked toward the hallway, one hand pressed against her ear, the other flat against the wall. Raymond watched her from the table, but didn't follow. Webb talked. She listened. She stood in the corridor, outside the cafe, with the overhead lights humming and the distant sound of the hospital. Moving around her cart's footsteps, a PA announcement, 2 floors up, and she listened to Webb tell her something that shifted the shape of everything she thought she understood about the last 14 months. Her face moved with it. She couldn't have stopped it if she'd tried. The information was too large for a controlled expression, each sentence landing somewhere specific and leaving a mark. When he finished, she stood there for a moment in the quiet of the hallway. How long do we have? She asked. Webb's answer came back without hesitation, flat and precise, the voice of a man who had been watching the clock longer than she had. The heart lands in Dallas in 6 hours. After that, it's gone. The parking garage on the south side of Texas Children's Hospital was the kind of place that existed purely as a function. Concrete pillars, fluorescent tubes, the smell of motor oil, and standing water from the storm 2 nights ago that hadn't fully drained yet. Nobody came here to think. It was a place you passed through on your way to somewhere else. Diana had been sitting in her car for 11 minutes with the engine off and her hands on the steering wheel and nowhere else to be. The rain had found Houston again. Not the violent sideways kind from the first storm, just a steady patient drumming on the roof of the Civic, the kind of rain that settles in and doesn't apologize for itself. It blurred the garage entrance into a soft gray curtain, turning the lights of the street beyond into diffuse smears of yellow and white. She had her phone in her lap and the USB drive in her right hand, and Webb's voice still moving through her head, laying out the thing he'd told her in pieces she was still assembling. She called Rosa. Rosa Mendez had lived next door to Diana for 4 years, had watched Elijah more hours than either of them had counted, had accepted every explanation and non-explanation Diana had ever offered with the particular grace of a woman who understood that people sometimes needed help more than they needed to justify needing it. When she picked up on the second ring, Diana told her everything. Not the edited version, not the version where she left out the parts that sounded impossible. All of it. The drive, the folder name, Raymond, Webb, the list, the heart in Dallas, the 6 hours. Rosa listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of answer. Rosa was not a woman who stayed quiet when she had something to say. When Diana finished the line, held a brief silence. "Baby," Rosa said. Her voice was the voice of someone who had raised 3 kids and buried a husband and still made tamales from scratch every Christmas because some things needed to be done right. "Let me ask you something. If it was you on that list, not Elijah, you were sitting at position 847 because someone had been moving names around for 4 years, what would you want the person holding that drive to do?" Diana looked at the rain. "I'd want them to use it," she said. "Then you already know what you're going to do." She sat with that for a moment. 847. She'd picked that number without thinking about it, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. The actual people behind it. The families she'd never meet, the mothers in waiting rooms in other hospitals, holding cold cups of coffee and watching the door, and praying the specific prayer of someone who has run out of other options. She thought about Elijah's drawing on the tray table upstairs. The 2 hearts, the careful arrows, the handwriting of a 6-year-old who had decided that understanding something was better than being afraid of it. She thought about Sarah, eyes closed, lips moving, fingers laced through hers. She thought about Raymond Cole, sitting in a corner cafe with an untouched cup of coffee. A man who had done a specific wrong thing for a long time and had arrived by way of a drainage channel in a rainstorm at the place where he had to decide what came next. She thought about what Webb had told her, the part that had changed the shape of everything, and how it meant that doing nothing was no longer an option she could live with, even if doing something came with no guarantees. She opened her contacts, found Raymond's number, pressed call. He answered on the first ring. "I'm giving you the USB, Diana said. No preamble, no softening. But we do this the right way. Every piece of documentation goes to the Federal Oversight Board, not to anyone connected to the hospital's existing administration. Chain of custody stays clean. Nothing gets handled privately." A pause on Raymond's end. Not the hesitation of a man deciding the pause, of a man who had already decided and was confirming that she'd arrived at the same place. "I'll contact my attorney," he said. "Not the one on retainer, with the holding company. Someone outside all of it." "Good." Diana watched a car pull into the garage through the blurred entrance headlights sweeping across the concrete. "And Raymond." She waited until the pause on his end told her he was listening carefully. "After this goes through, when the Oversight Board opens an inquiry, and they need someone with direct knowledge of how the arrangements worked, you're going to testify. On record. All of it." The rain kept its steady rhythm on the roof of the car. "I know," Raymond said quietly. She ended the call and sat for a moment, with the phone in her lap and the USB in her hand, and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision they can't unmake, and found, on the other side of making it, something that felt less like certainty than like clarity. She reached forward and put the key in the ignition. The radio came on, with the engine mid-sentence, the measured urgency of a weather broadcaster who had been trained to deliver bad news in a calm voice, reiterating the National Weather Service advisory issued at 8:47 this evening. A second storm system has been confirmed, making landfall along the Gulf Coast, and is expected to reach the greater Houston metro area in approximately 4 hours. Current projected intensity is Category 2, with storm surge warnings in effect for... Diana's hand rested on the gear shift without moving it. Through the blurred entrance of the parking garage, the sky above Houston had gone a particular shade of dark. Not the ordinary dark of a cloudy night, but the specific, pressurized darkness of a sky that was building toward something and had already decided it was coming, regardless of what anyone down below thought about it. Inside the hospital, time had a different texture than it did in the parking garage. Raymond had commandeered a small conference room on the second floor, one of the family consultation rooms that sat empty at this hour. And his attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, whom he had called from the parking garage 30 minutes after Diana's call, and who had driven directly from her home in Sugarland, without asking more than 2 questions, was sitting across from him with her laptop open and the USB drive plugged into a portable decryption tool she'd pulled from her bag, with the practiced efficiency of someone who kept it there for exactly this kind of situation. Patricia Osei had been a federal compliance attorney for 19 years. She did not startle easily, but when the first file came open and she read through the initial document, a dated memorandum outlining the terms of the first arrangement signed by Raymond and countersigned by a name Diana would have recognized, she sat back in her chair and looked at Raymond for a long moment before she said anything. "How many files are on here?" she asked. 18. She looked back at the screen. "I'm going to need the night. You have less than that." Raymond glanced at his phone. Outside the conference room's single window, the wind had picked up enough to push the rain against the glass in irregular bursts. The second storm was still an hour from landfall, but Houston could already feel it coming. The particular atmospheric pressure drop that the city recognized the way an old injury recognizes weather. The donor match. Do you know enough yet to say whether the Oversight Board can initiate an emergency review? Patricia typed something without looking up. If these documents are authenticated, and they will be, the metadata alone is going to make that straightforward, then yes. Emergency jurisdiction applies when there's documented evidence of systemic interference in a federal program. I can have a preliminary filing ready in 3 hours. We may not have 3 hours for the match. She looked up then. Tell me about the match. He told her. She listened, typed, asked 2 precise questions. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a second phone. Her work phone. Raymond assumed the kind of second phone that attorneys carried when they needed to keep categories separate, and made a call. Raymond watched the window. The rain was finding its rhythm now, the irregular bursts, evening out into something more sustained, more committed. The palm trees visible from the second floor were bending in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. His own phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He answered. "Mr. Cole." The voice was professional, clipped the voice of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously and treating each one with equal precision. "My name is James Cooper. I'm the Regional Transplant Coordination Supervisor for the Gulf Coast Organ Sharing Network. I'm calling because your name appears in our system as an emergency contact for Texas Children's Hospital's Administrative Oversight Committee, and we have a situation that requires immediate escalation." Raymond sat up straighter. "Go ahead." "The donor organ matched to 2 recipients at your facility departed Dallas by ground transport 40 minutes ago. Standard protocol, the flight window closed when the second storm advisory was issued, and air transport was grounded." A pause, measured and deliberate. "The transport vehicle is currently stopped on Highway 59 southbound at the Hillcroft interchange. Storm surge from the outer bands has flooded the interchange to a depth that the vehicle cannot safely cross. We have confirmed no alternative route that is currently passable by standard emergency vehicle." The conference room had gone very quiet. Patricia had lowered her phone. She was listening. "Distance to the hospital?" Raymond asked. 4.2 miles. Time remaining on organ viability. 91 minutes from this moment. Cooper's voice didn't change. It was the voice of a man who delivered impossible information in the same register as ordinary information, because falling apart served no one. "We have contacted Houston Fire and Rescue regarding boat transport. Current response time estimate is 2 hours minimum. All units are deployed for flood rescue operations across the city. We have contacted the Coast Guard Air Station. All rotary aircraft are grounded due to sustained wind speeds. We have contacted..." "Mr. Cooper." Raymond stood up. "Is there a route, any route between the transport vehicle's current position in this hospital that is passable on foot or by a vehicle with high ground clearance?" A pause. The sound of typing. "There are 2 potential surface routes That our mapping system shows as marginally passable, Cooper said slowly. I want to be precise about that word marginally. Both involve sections, currently running between 1 and 2 feet of moving water. Standard emergency vehicles cannot navigate them safely. A smaller, lighter vehicle with a driver who has direct familiarity with the terrain might be able to manage the first route as far as the Bel Air intersection, at which point— Hold on. Raymond looked across the room. Diana was standing in the doorway. He didn't know when she'd come in. She'd been in the parking garage. Then she hadn't been. And now she was here, still in her jacket, with her keys in her hand, having apparently followed the chain of people and rooms that led to wherever things were being decided tonight. She'd heard enough. He could tell from the way she was already standing, not leaning against the doorframe, not waiting for a summary, standing like someone who had arrived at a door and was about to go through it. Raymond held out the phone. Cooper's voice came through the speaker into the quiet room. If that heart doesn't reach us in 90 minutes, we lose it. And the next compatible match for either recipient, we cannot project a timeline. The room held its silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Diana stepped fully inside, took the phone from Raymond's hand, and said, I know every flooded street in this city. I've been driving them for 6 years. She looked at Raymond once, then at Patricia, then back at the phone. Give me the route. I'll bring it in. The headlights cut into the dark and found nothing reassuring. Diana pulled out of the hospital's south entrance, onto Fannin Street, and immediately understood the difference between the first storm and this one. The first storm had been an emergency. This one was something older and less negotiable. The kind of weather that didn't arrive so much as assert itself, that replaced the city's ordinary logic with its own. The street was already running, not pooling, not puddling, running, moving water with direction and purpose, catching her headlights and throwing them back, broken and scattered. She had Cooper in her earpiece and the route on her phone mounted to the dash. And she drove the way she'd learned to drive in 4 years of Houston deliveries, not fast, but committed, reading the road 10 seconds ahead and making decisions before they became emergencies. Westheimer is completely blocked at Shepherd, Cooper's voice said in her ear. Calm, precise, the voice of a man managing from a map. Your first turn is coming up on your left. She was already turning. The side street was darker residential. The streetlights out on this block. The houses on either side showing only the occasional flicker of a generator light behind closed curtains. The water here was shallower, running off lawns and across the asphalt in thin, fast sheets, rather than the deeper accumulation of the main road. Her tires found grip. She pushed forward. 63 minutes, Cooper said. She didn't answer. She needed her focus elsewhere. The route Cooper had given her ran through 4 miles of streets she knew in daylight and was relearning in the dark. The cut-through behind the strip mall, on West Park, the service road that ran parallel to the freeway, for half a mile before it rejoined the surface streets. The low-clearance underpass she specifically avoided in rain because it collected water faster than the drain could handle it. She went around the underpass, added 90 seconds to the route, didn't think twice about it. Water depth increasing on your current block, Cooper said. Storm surge is running faster than projected. She could feel it. The resistance against the tires had changed from the thin, running sheets of before to something deeper, something that pushed back with actual weight when she moved through it. She dropped her speed and kept moving. Stopping was not a category she was operating in tonight. 45 minutes. The strip mall cut-through was clear. The service road was passable, but barely water to the middle of her wheel wells. The Civic's engine running higher than she liked, complaining about the conditions in the particular way of a car, being asked to do something outside its design parameters. She talked to it the way she sometimes talked to Elijah when he was struggling quietly, without making a big deal of it, just acknowledging that it was hard and asking it to keep going anyway. It kept going. She saw the ambulance from 2 blocks away. The vehicle was stopped at an angle across Bel Air Boulevard, its emergency lights still running, the red and white rotation, painting everything around it in slow, alternating sweeps. The water around it was visibly deeper than anything Diana had driven through, yet it was up past the vehicle's running boards, halfway to the door handles, and it was moving. A paramedic was standing on the vehicle's rear bumper to stay above the waterline. When Diana pulled up as close as she dared and rolled down her window, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had run out of options 20 minutes ago and wasn't going to waste time being surprised by whatever came next. "The box," Diana said. "Give it to me." He didn't ask questions. He waded to her passenger side thigh deep, the water pushing at him visibly, and handed the insulated transport case through the window. Rectangular handled, marked with the universal medical symbols that meant handle this carefully and mean it. She set it on the passenger seat, kept one hand on it, and drove. 30 minutes, Cooper said. The engine started its complaint 3 blocks later. Not a sudden failure, a gradual reluctance, a roughness at idle that she'd heard before. On bad nights, when the Civic got more water in places, water shouldn't go. She pushed through it. 2 blocks. The roughness became something worse. 1 block. The hospital's lights were visible from here. She could see the upper floors above the rooflines, the particular brightness of a building that ran on backup power and kept everything lit regardless. She could see it. It was right there. The engine quit between 1 second and the next, without ceremony, the way things end when they've simply had enough. The headlights stayed on battery, not alternator, and in their light, she could see the water around the car, still and dark, impatient on all sides, up to the door sills. Now, the current moving against the driver's side, with a slow, steady insistence. The clock on the dash read 8 minutes. Diana sat in the silence of a dead car, with the hospital lights visible through the rain-blurred windshield, one hand still on the transport case, on the passenger seat, the other on the door handle. 8 minutes. She looked at the case, looked at the water outside, looked at the hospital lights. She opened the door. The water came in immediately cold, dark smelling of rain and street, and everything the storm had picked up on its way through the city. It rose to her shins as she stepped out, then to her knees as she found the road beneath it uneven and slick, but there solid under her feet. She reached back in, lifted the transport case with both hands, and held it above the waterline. Then she started walking. 2 blocks behind her, her car was sitting in 3 feet of moving water, with its hazard lights still blinking. She could see them in the distance. When she turned her head, orange pulses almost immediately by the rain and the dark. She didn't turn her head again after that. The water was at her hips now, in the low sections, dropping to her knees, on the slight rises in the road, never below her shins, anywhere. It had a current, not violent, not the kind that took your feet out from under you all at once, but the persistent sideways lean of moving water that made every step a small negotiation between where she wanted to go and where it wanted to take her. She kept her weight forward and her arms up in the transport case above the waterline, and she moved. Her phone was in her jacket's upper pocket, the one with the zipper. She got it out left-handed without stopping. "Cooper." Her voice came out rougher than she expected. The cold had gotten into her chest somewhere in the last 10 minutes. "Diana." His voice was different from earlier, still controlled, but with something underneath the control that hadn't been there before. The sound of a man watching something on a map that he couldn't do anything about. "Where are you?" "On foot, 4 blocks out." A pause. "Diana, the water depth on that route." "How much time?" Another pause. "Shorter. 22 minutes. "Then I need you to stop telling me about the water depth." She put the phone back in her pocket and kept moving. The streetlights had been going out in sequence since she left the car, not all at once, but one by one, the grid losing sections, as the storm found whatever it was looking for in the city's infrastructure. By the time she reached the 3rd block, the last one went. Just like that. The block ahead of her went from dim to completely, absolutely dark, the kind of dark that has no gradation, no adjustment period, just the absence of everything. She stopped, got the phone back out, turned the flashlight on. The beam was narrow and threw more shadow than light, but it was something enough to see the road surface, 2 feet ahead enough to find the edge of the curb before she walked off it enough to keep the direction. She held it in her teeth for 30 seconds while she adjusted her grip on the transport case, then took it back in her left hand and pointed it forward and walked. The block was the longest one. It always was not in actual distance, but in the particular way time moves when you're doing something that requires your complete and undivided attention. And there's nothing to think about except the next step and the one after that. The water pulled at her. The rain came down without apology. Her shoes had filled in the first 30 seconds, and she'd stopped noticing them sometime after that. She was halfway down the block when her right foot found a gap, a storm drain cover that had shifted under the pressure of the current, leaving an irregular depression in the road surface. Her ankle turned. She went sideways, one knee dropping toward the water, her left arm shooting out for balance and finding nothing. The transport case swung. She caught it with her right hand before it went under pure reflex, the grab of someone who had been holding on to something important for so long that letting go wasn't a physical option anymore. Her knee hit the road underwater, and she felt it a sharp, specific impact that she filed away for later and did not attend to now. She got her feet under her, got upright, checked the case, still sealed, still above the waterline, still moving forward. She didn't stop. There was no version of tonight where she stopped. The hospital appeared the way things appear when you've been looking for them long enough. Not gradually, not with warning, just suddenly. They're the upper floors, rising above the roofline of the last building on the block, lit from within, with the steady, indifferent brightness of a place that was built to stay open regardless. And then there were lights below it too. Moving lights, flashlights, several of them coming toward her from the hospital's side entrance at a pace that suggested someone had been watching from a window and had seen her coming before she saw them. 3 figures in scrubs, wading into the water with the kind of focused urgency that meant Cooper had called ahead that someone had been standing at that window for the last 12 minutes watching the street. The first one reached her in water to his waist and took the transport case from her hands with both of his, raising it high, and she let it go. Just like that. It was there, and then it wasn't, and someone else was carrying it toward the light. The other 2 reached her a moment later. She waved them off. She didn't need. Carrying her legs were still working. She just needed the next 40 feet to be horizontal. They walked beside her, anyway, close enough to catch her if she needed it, and she didn't argue. The hospital's side entrance was 3 steps up from the street level, which put the threshold just above the current waterline. She climbed them and stood under the overhang and watched the team carry the transport case through the inner doors and disappear around the corner. And then she sat down on the top step because her legs had made a unilateral decision about the matter. The rain came down past the overhang's edge, in a curtain she was no longer inside of. She sat in the relative dry and breathed. Her phone buzzed. Webb. Diana. His voice was the voice of a man in motion. Background, sounds of a medical floor behind him. Cart's voices, the particular compressed energy of a team preparing. We have it. We're prepping now. She closed her eyes. Is he going to be okay? The pause lasted 1 second. It was the longest second she had ever personally experienced. We're going to do everything we can, Webb said. The rain kept falling past the edge of the overhang. Somewhere above her, in a room, she couldn't see, a team of people was getting ready to open her son's chest and give him something she had just carried 4 blocks through a flooded city in the dark. She sat on the step and breathed and didn't try to do anything else. By 2 a.m, the 4th floor waiting room had settled into the particular stillness of a place where everyone present had run out of things to do except wait. Diana was sitting in the chair closest to the hallway door, still in the clothes she'd walked through the storm in. Her jacket had dried unevenly, stiff in some places, still damp in others, and her shoes had left a faint waterline on the linoleum, where she'd first sat down 2 hours ago before someone quietly moved a mop bucket through and pretended not to notice. Nobody had suggested she go home and change. Nobody had suggested much of anything, There was a blanket across her shoulders that she didn't remember accepting, and a cup of tea on the table beside her that Rosa had put there and that she hadn't touched. Rosa herself was in the chair, to Diana's left, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She wasn't talking. Rosa, who had an opinion about most things, and the vocabulary to express it at length, had been sitting quietly for 90 minutes, which was its own form of love, the understanding that some company is not about filling silence, but about making sure the silence isn't empty. Raymond was across the room. He'd been there when Diana came up from the entrance level, already seated in the corner chair, farthest from the door, his coat folded across his knees, his hands resting on top of it. He looked like a man who had decided that the least he could do was stay, and had stayed, and was not going to make it into something larger than that by moving around or drawing attention to himself. Diana looked at him for a long moment from across the room. Then she got up, crossed the waiting area, and sat down in the empty chair beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Patricia filed the preliminary documentation at 11:40, Raymond said finally. His voice was quiet, calibrated to the room. The Oversight Board has opened an emergency inquiry. It's in process. Diana nodded. She already knew. Patricia had sent her a message. The silence came back. It was a different kind of silence from the one with Rosa, less comfortable, more weighted the silence of two people who had things between them that hadn't been fully accounted for yet. "Can I ask you something?" Diana said. "Yes. The first time. Not the system, not the arrangements. The first time you signed a specific name to a specific file and moved a child down the list." She kept her voice level, not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to know. "What did you tell yourself?" Raymond was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "That it was one time," he said. "That the child I was moving up had been waiting nearly as long. That the family had contributed significantly to the hospital's funding, which meant more equipment, more staff, more capacity to help more children overall." He paused. "I had 3 reasons. I remember all 3 of them. They were good reasons. I believed them. And the second time, 2 reasons. I only needed 2 by then." The fluorescent light above them hummed its single note. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in its steady, mechanical rhythm. "By the 4th or 5th time," Raymond continued, "I didn't need reasons anymore. It had become the thing I did, and the thing I did had become the thing I was. And somewhere in that transition," he stopped, looked at his hands. "There was a file, a 7-year-old girl in Galveston. I signed it without reading her name first. That was the moment I became the thing I'm ashamed of." He said it without drama, without self-pity, the way you state a fact you've spent a long time arriving at. "Not the first signature, the one where I stopped reading the names." Diana sat with it for a moment. "I called the Federal Oversight Board at 10:15 tonight," Raymond said. "Patricia walked me through the full disclosure process. Everything on that drive, everything in the files, everything I know about how the arrangements were structured and who was involved." He looked at the far wall. "It's done. All of it." "I know," Diana said. "She told me." They sat in the quiet of the waiting room, and outside the windows, Houston's second storm was finishing its business with the city. The wind lower now, the rain steadier and less aggressive, the kind of weather that was winding down rather than building up. The door to the waiting room opened. Sarah Whitmore came in still wearing the pale blue sweater, her hair damp from the rain. A look on her face that said she had been somewhere else tonight and had come here anyway, and that the coming here had been a decision she'd made about herself rather than about Diana. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room Rosa, Raymond, Diana, in her storm-stiff jacket, with the blanket across her shoulders. Her eyes found Diana's. There was a question in them, and then the question answered itself, and Sarah crossed the room without hurrying and sat down in the empty chair on Diana's other side. She didn't say anything. She reached over and took Diana's hand in both of hers the way she had in the waiting room that afternoon and held on. Diana looked at her. Sarah looked back. Between them passed the specific understanding of 2 women who had arrived at the same place from different directions and found on arrival that the differences mattered less than the place itself. On Diana's left, Rosa sat, with her shoulder touching Diana's, quiet and steady, as she'd been all night. On Diana's right, Sarah held her hand and closed her eyes. And somewhere beyond the double doors at the end of the hall, in a room none of them could enter, a team of people were working on a small boy who had drawn 2 hearts with a red crayon and given one of them to his mother. At 3:15 in the morning, the operating room on the 6th floor of Texas Children's Hospital was the brightest place in a city that had spent the last several hours losing its lights one neighborhood at a time. The overheads ran on the hospital's backup grid, steady, unwavering, the particular quality of light that exists only in operating rooms, which is less like illumination and more like the complete elimination of shadow. Everything in that light was exactly what it was. Nothing could be approximated or suggested or partially seen. Webb had always found this clarifying. Tonight, it felt like something closer to judgment. Elijah Carter was small on the table. Webb had performed somewhere in the range of 400 procedures in this room over 11 years. He knew intellectually that patients always looked smaller under anesthesia. Something about stillness, about the removal of all the energy and movement and presence that a person normally occupied space with. He knew this. It had never stopped being true, and it had never stopped affecting him. But this particular child, this particular morning, was small in a way that had nothing to do with anesthesia. He was small because Webb knew his name, because he'd seen his file come across his desk 14 times in 14 months and had made a specific, deliberate choice about it each time. Because the chart on the wall of this room listed his age as 6 years and his admitting diagnosis in the careful, neutral language of medicine. And Webb had sat in his office 2 nights ago and told his mother that there were standard escalation protocols, and he would make sure everything was properly documented. And he had meant neither of those things when he said them. He stood at the table and looked at the child for a moment before the procedure began, a moment that was not in any protocol that no one on his team remarked upon, because they had worked with Webb long enough to understand that he had his own way of beginning a stillness he required before the first movement. What he was doing in that stillness was not a ritual. It was a reckoning. He thought about the first file, not Elijah's, the first one. 4 years ago, a child from Beaumont, whose name he had read carefully, whose photograph he had looked at in the chart, about whom he had constructed an entire justification before he picked up the pen. He had needed all of that the first time. The name, the photograph, the architecture of reasons. He thought about what he'd told Diana in his office that morning. By the 4th or 5th time, he hadn't needed reasons anymore. The thing had become routine, and routine had a way of making the weight of things disappear. Not because the weight wasn't there, but because you stopped feeling it. He had stopped feeling it. He picked up the first instrument. The procedure moved in the way that procedures moved when everything was working as it should, the team communicating in the compressed, efficient shorthand of people who had done this together, before the monitors providing their continuous commentary in numbers and lines. The room existing in its own sealed time, separate from the storm outside, and the waiting room 4 floors below, and everything else that was true about the world tonight. Webb worked and did not think in words. This was the part of medicine he had never lost, the place where his hands knew things. His mind didn't need to supervise, where 11 years of training and practice and accumulated judgment operated below the level of conscious thought. Whatever he had done in the administrative parts of his life, whatever he had signed and deferred and looked away from his hands, had never been part of it. His hands had always done exactly what they were supposed to do. He held on to that tonight. It was not a small thing to hold on to. The new heart came to him the way these moments always came, announced by a shift in the room's atmosphere before anyone said anything out loud. The team moved around him, and Webb positioned himself, and there was a period of time that he could not have given a duration to in which the most important thing happening in the city of Houston was the placement of one small, healthy heart into one small waiting chest. He had done this before. He knew what came next. And still, he waited for it, the way you wait for something you've seen 100 times and cannot make yourself stop hoping for the particular suspension of a room full of people who have done everything they can do and are now in the presence of something outside their control. The monitor changed. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just a shift in the line on the screen. A new rhythm establishing itself, finding its pattern, the tentative first beats of something that had been placed in a new home, and was deciding in the way that living things decide such things, that it would continue. Steady, even, strong. Webb stood still and watched the line on the monitor for a long moment. The room around him had the quality of an exhale, not loud, not celebratory, just the collective release of breath that a room holds when it has been waiting for permission to breathe normally again. He said what needed to be said to his team. The procedure moved into its closing phase. His hands continued their work. But something in the room had changed, in the way rooms change, when the thing everyone came to do has been done. He came out of the ORR at 4:47 in the morning, through the double doors, and into the corridor, and walked 12 steps to the wall, and put his back against it, and slid down slightly, until he felt the solid resistance of the building behind him. He pulled his mask down around his chin, closed his eyes. The hallway was empty, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the floor, doing its nighttime work, the soft footsteps of the overnight staff, the occasional beep of a monitor behind a closed door, the building's quiet, ongoing machinery of care. Webb stood against the wall and breathed, and the breathing turned into something else, and he let it. He had spent 11 years in this hospital, being the person in the room who did not fall apart, who held the steadiness that other people needed, who managed what his face was doing, because his face was information, and his patients and their families were reading it constantly. He had no patience in this hallway. No one was reading him. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes and stood there in the empty corridor outside the room where a 6-year-old boy was being closed up with a new heart beating inside him. And for the first time in more years than he could accurately count, Marcus Webb let himself come apart for a minute. Just a minute. Then he reached for his phone. The sun came back to Houston the way it always did, after a storm without apology, without acknowledgement of what had happened, just light arriving through the east-facing windows of the 4th floor waiting room and laying itself across the floor in long, pale rectangles that hadn't been there an hour ago. Diana saw it before she registered anything else. She had been awake all night, and her eyes had gone to that particular place that eyes go after too many hours, without sleep, not closed, not fully open, just existing in the middle distance, without much purpose. The light touched the floor, and she noticed it, the way you notice something that has been absent long enough that its return feels significant, even if you can't immediately say why. Rosa was asleep in the chair beside her, her head tilted at the angle of someone who had lost the fight against exhaustion, sometime around 5, and hadn't moved since. Sarah was on Diana's other side, awake, her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing, with the steady patience of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Raymond was in his corner, still there, still awake. He had not slept either. Diana could tell from the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone holding themselves together through will rather than rest. The waiting room door opened at 7:04. Webb came through it in his regular clothes. He'd changed out of his scrubs at some point, which Diana's mind noted and filed as information, without yet understanding what it meant. He looked like a man who had been up all night and had made peace with it. He looked in some way she couldn't immediately name different from every other time she had seen him in this building. He found her face across the room and walked directly to her. Diana stood up. She didn't remember deciding to. The surgery was successful, Webb said. He said it quietly, the way you say something that is large enough to require care in the handling. Elijah's new heart is beating strong and steady. The room did something. Diana couldn't have described it. Not a sound, not a movement, just a shift in whatever the air in a room is made of, when it has been holding something for a long time and is finally allowed to put it down. Her knees made a decision independent of the rest of her. Rosa caught her awake, between 1 second and the next, both arms out, the reflexes of a woman who had been ready for this, even in her sleep. They went down together, not falling so much as arriving at the floor, and held on to each other in the particular way of people for whom words have temporarily stopped being an option. Diana was aware dimly of Webb's hand on her shoulder. She was aware of Sarah beside her, making no sound, her hand pressed to her own mouth. She was aware of the light still coming through the windows, indifferent and golden, and exactly what the morning required. She was aware, across the room, of Raymond Cole, standing in his corner, with his head bowed and his hands clasped in front of him, not moving, not speaking, in the posture of a man doing the only thing he had left to offer. The recovery room was on the same floor, down a different hallway. A nurse led Diana through the double doors at 7:20, and Diana walked the corridor with the particular careful steadiness of someone who has used everything they had and is running on the other side of empty, where the body keeps moving out of something deeper than energy. The room was quiet. The machines were doing their work, the steady mechanical testimony of monitors that had been reporting good news for the past 2 hours and were continuing to do so. There were lines and tubes and the careful, practiced arrangements of post-surgical care, and in the middle of all of it, very small, against the white of the bed, was Elijah. Diana sat down beside him. She didn't reach for his hand yet. She just looked at him, the way you look at something you were afraid you might not see again, slowly taking inventory, making sure it was real. The monitors, the lines, the slow, even rise and fall of his chest, and his lips. She had been looking at Elijah's lips for 6 years. Since before he could talk, since the first time a doctor had pointed to the faint discoloration and explained what it meant. She had been watching them, the way you watch a gauge, reading them for information, the way other parents read their children's expressions. She knew every shade they had ever been. She knew the difference between tired blue and cold blue, and the particular dusky color they turned when his body was working too hard. She had never in 6 years seen them the color they were right now. Pink, not the pale, provisional pink of a good day. A full, warm, confident pink, the pink of a child whose blood was moving through his body exactly the way it was supposed to, oxygenating everything it touched, doing its work without apology or compromise. She looked at them for a long time. Then Elijah's eyes opened. He didn't startle. He came up from the anesthesia the way he did most things, thoughtfully, taking his time, looking around the room with the careful attention of someone who wanted to understand where he was before he committed to being there. His eyes found the ceiling, found the window, found Diana. "Mama." His voice was rough from the breathing tube, smaller than usual, but entirely his. The same voice that explained cardiac anatomy to nurses in debated crayon colors and asked questions about everything. Did it work? Diana opened her mouth, closed it. She nodded. The tears came down her face without any drama, not the heaving kind, not the kind that announced itself. Just water moving down her cheeks and dropping onto the hand she finally reached out and placed over his. Elijah looked at her hand on his, then at her face, then at the rest of her, the jacket that had dried wrong, the hair that had not been attended to since yesterday morning, the general appearance of someone who had been through something significant and was only now arriving at the other side of it. His brow pulled together in the particular way it did when he was assembling information into a question. "Mama." He looked at her more carefully. "Were you out in the storm?" Diana looked at her son, at his pink lips and his careful eyes, and the monitors behind him reporting their steady good news in numbers and lines. She thought about Bel Air Boulevard and the dead engine and 4 blocks of moving water in the dark. She thought about the transport case above her head and her phone in her teeth and the hospital lights visible through the rain. She looked at him for a long moment. "I just went to get something for you," she said. 3 days later, Every television in Texas Children's Hospital was showing the same face. Diana saw it first. In the hallway outside Elijah's room, on the mounted screen above the nurse's station, the noon news, the volume low, the captions running their slightly delayed translation across the bottom of the frame. Raymond Cole's photograph in the upper corner of the screen. The kind of photograph that news programs used when they needed something official, something that conveyed the distance between who a person appeared to be and what was currently being said about them. She stopped and read the captions for a moment. Then she went in to check on Elijah, who was sitting up in bed, eating applesauce, and explaining to his day nurse why the human circulatory system was, in his considered opinion, more interesting than most people gave it credit for. His lips were still pink. She checked every time. She suspected she would check for a long time. The Federal Oversight Board had opened its formal inquiry 48 hours after Patricia Osei filed the preliminary documentation. That was fast by the standards of federal processes, fast enough that the people who understood how these things worked had raised their eyebrows when they heard the timeline. Patricia had told Diana, in the measured way she delivered all information, that the speed was a function of the documentation's quality. 18 files, fully authenticated, with metadata and signatures, and a chain of correspondence that left very little room for interpretation. Raymond had testified on the second day. Diana hadn't been in the room for that. She'd been in the hospital where Elijah was progressing through recovery with the focused determination of a child who had been told he could go home in 2 weeks and had decided that 2 weeks was a deadline. But Patricia had called her afterward and described it in the precise, unembellished way she described everything. He had answered every question. He had not invoked any protections. He had brought documentation beyond what was requested and had offered context that incriminated himself further when he felt the board's understanding of the arrangements was incomplete. He had, in Patricia's assessment, behaved like a man who had decided that the only version of this he could live with was the version where he said everything. 847 files were under review. The number had appeared in every news report, in every conversation Diana overheard in the hospital corridors. 847 families who had been waiting for a phone call that had been pushed further away by a system that was supposed to protect them. Webb had walked into the hospital's administrative offices on the morning of the second day and submitted a full written account of his involvement. His medical license was suspended, pending review. He had said, according to the colleague who told Diana about it later, almost nothing, except that he wanted it on record that his cooperation was voluntary and complete. Diana had been asked to provide a written statement documenting the chain of custody of the drive from the night she found it to the night she gave it to Raymond. She had written it at the small table in Elijah's hospital room, while he slept, in the careful, specific way she had learned to write things that mattered: every date, every detail, nothing omitted. Her phone rang on the afternoon of the third day, while she was sitting in the hospital's first-floor cafe with a coffee she was actually drinking this time. Sarah. Diana. Her voice had a quality Diana hadn't heard in it before. Not the careful steadiness of a woman holding herself together, but something lighter and more fragile, the voice of someone who had just been handed something they weren't sure yet how to carry. I just got off the phone with the transplant coordinator. Diana set down her cup. They reviewed Tyler's file as part of the audit, Sarah continued. His actual position on the list, his legitimate position based solely on his medical status, and wait time is 23. A pause. He's been at 23 this whole time. They moved him to 89. I didn't know. Diana, I need you to know that I didn't know. Her voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough? I know you didn't, Diana said. I would never have... Sarah. Diana kept her voice even and warm, the voice she used with Elijah when he needed to hear something true. I know. I knew before you called. A long exhale on the other end of the line. The sound of someone putting something down that had been very heavy. Tyler has a match, Sarah said quietly. They called this morning. The surgery is next week. Diana closed her eyes. That's everything, she said. That's exactly everything. After they hung up, she sat with her coffee in the afternoon light coming through the cafe windows and thought about the waiting room on the 4th floor and 2 women with cold cups of coffee and one prayer between them that there would be enough for both. It turned out there had been. It had just been in the wrong places. Raymond called at 4:17, 2 hours after the afternoon session of his testimony concluded. "It's done," he said. "All of it. Every file, every name, every arrangement going back to the beginning. It's in the record now." Diana looked out the cafe window at Houston in the afternoon, the city going about its business in the particular energetic way of a place that had been through something and had come out the other side still standing. Streets still showing the water lines from the storms, crews still clearing debris in some neighborhoods, but the sky overhead was the deep, committed blue of a Texas October afternoon that had decided to be beautiful. "What happens to you now?" she asked. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Not the strategic quiet of a man choosing his words. The genuine quiet of someone sitting with a question that didn't have a clean answer. "There will be consequences," he said. "Legal financial professional. I've known that since the night I called Patricia. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not looking for a way around that." "Good," Diana said. Not unkindly. "There's something I need to ask you," Raymond said, "before any of the next part starts. Well, it's still just this." Diana waited. "What is it?" she said. A pause. Through the phone, she could hear the particular ambient sound of a room with a view, air conditioning, distant traffic, the quality of space that came with height. "How do you rebuild something," Raymond said, "that you broke on purpose?" The cafe hummed around her. Somewhere behind the counter, someone was grinding coffee beans. A child at the table near the window was drawing something on a paper placemat with a crayon, the focused industry of a person with a clear idea and a limited surface. Diana looked at the child for a moment. Then she looked back at her phone and thought about what an honest answer to that question might actually sound like. The stone carvers finished on a Tuesday morning in November, and by noon, the scaffolding was down, and the new inscription sat alongside the older ones on the donor wall, near the main corridor in the same clean serif font as everything else, as if it had always been there. The Elijah Fund for every child who cannot wait. Raymond had been present for the installation, but had not made a ceremony of it. He'd stood to one side, watched the workers finish, looked at the letters for a long moment without moving. Then he had nodded once and gone inside. He had a meeting with Diana at 2 o'clock. He had those most days now. The fund had taken shape faster than anyone expected. Raymond had liquidated a significant portion of his personal assets in the weeks following his testimony and directed the proceeds into an independently administered charitable structure with no connection to any entity named in the Oversight Board's inquiry. The mandate was straightforward: full coverage of transplant-related costs for pediatric patients whose insurance left gaps their families couldn't bridge. No deposit requirements. Diana had written that last part herself. She had said yes on a Wednesday afternoon in the hospital cafe 3 weeks after the surgery, directly, without qualification, after having clearly thought it through. She had an office now on the 2nd floor, a small room with a window over the courtyard. 3 things on her desk: a photograph of Elijah, a coffee mug from Rosa, and the crayon drawing of 2 hearts in a frame. Webb had lost his license for 2 years. He had accepted this without appeal. He spent the first month writing a detailed account of how the arrangements had operated at the clinical level, the pressure, the mechanisms, the gaps in the law that had made it all possible, and submitted it to 3 separate regulatory bodies. He had also sent Diana a handwritten letter, 4 pages. She had read it twice and put it in the drawer at home rather than at the office, which was its own kind of answer. Sarah came on Tuesdays. They worked the family intake sessions together, sitting across from parents in the early stages of fear and paperwork and impossibility, and Diana watched Sarah speak to those families with a gentleness that could only come from having lived it. Tyler had received his heart the previous week. Sarah had texted Diana from the waiting room at 4 in the morning, mostly incoherent and completely clear. Diana had sat up in the dark and read it, and not tried to sleep again after that. Elijah arrived on a Thursday afternoon because Diana had a late meeting and Rosa had brought him from school. He came through the main entrance at 3:45, stopped at the donor wall, the way he sometimes did, found the new inscription, stood in front of it for a moment. Then he went to find his mother. He found Raymond first. Raymond was coming out of the administrative wing with a folder when the small figure appeared in the corridor. "You're Mr. Raymond," Elijah said. Not a question. "I am. My mama said you helped save me." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Thank you." And then, because he was 6 and had a clear relationship with gratitude, he stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Raymond's legs and held on before stepping back and looking up expectantly. Raymond looked down at the boy. He had testified for 7 hours across 2 days. He had answered every question from attorneys, regulators, and journalists without flinching. He stood in the corridor of Texas Children's Hospital, looked at a 6-year-old with pink lips and a crayon smudge on his left hand, and found for the first time he could remember that he had absolutely nothing to say. He crouched down to Elijah's level. "You're welcome," he said finally, quietly, like it was the most important thing he'd said in months, which it probably was. Diana got home at 7:30. The house, a rental, 2 bedrooms, a yard, where Elijah had been running experiments every afternoon since his doctor cleared him, was quiet in the way it was quiet when he was asleep. She hung her keys by the door, took off the navy blazer she'd worn since the fund's first family intake session that morning, and hung it beside Elijah's backpack. She passed the bathroom mirror on her way to the kitchen. She stopped. The woman looking back wore the same face she'd always had, same dark eyes, same line between her brows, same way of holding her jaw when she was tired. Nothing added, nothing removed, but something had settled. The specific misalignment of a person spending most of their energy surviving instead of living had found its place. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who had set down what she was carrying and had not yet picked it back up. Diana looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to make dinner. The April sun hit Houston differently than it had 6 months ago. No wall of rain, no water climbing past stop signs, no sky that felt like it was trying to swallow the city whole. Just light, the ordinary kind, spreading across the blacktop of Houston Elementary's track, like it had always been there, like nothing had ever tried to take it away. Diana Reyes stood at the edge of the field, with her hands folded in front of her, wearing the same navy blazer she'd hung on the hook the night she finally recognized herself in the mirror. Rosa stood 2 feet to her left, phone raised, already recording before the starting whistle blew. "He's going to trip," Rosa said. "He always looks at his feet." "He doesn't do that anymore," Diana said. Rosa lowered the phone half an inch. "When did that change?" Diana didn't answer. She already knew it changed the morning Elijah walked out of Texas Children's Hospital with pink lips and a chest that rose and fell on its own. It changed the first time he ran down the apartment hallway, just to feel his legs move. It changed every single day after that, quietly, in ways that didn't announce themselves. Across the track, 8 kids lined up at the start. Elijah stood third from the left in a red jersey, number 11 sneakers, that were already slightly too small, because Diana hadn't caught up to how fast he was growing. He bounced on his toes twice, looked up, found her face in the small crowd. She raised one hand. He grinned, the kind of grin that had no caution in it, no held breath behind it. Just a 7-year-old boy who didn't know yet that the world was complicated. Or maybe he did know, Diana thought. Maybe he just decided not to let that stop him. The whistle blew. 8 kids surged forward. Elijah went wide on the first curve, the way he always did, cutting too far to the outside. Rosa groaned softly, but then he corrected, found his lane, and settled into something that wasn't speed so much as determination. His arms pumped. His sneakers slapped the track in an even rhythm. He passed 2 kids on the back stretch. Rosa grabbed Diana's arm. Elijah crossed the finish line second. He didn't seem to notice. He threw both arms straight up anyway, head tilted back like second place. in first place felt exactly the same from the inside. The parent beside Diana started clapping. Rosa was already crying, trying to hide it behind her phone screen. Diana pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, slow and even, the way she'd learned to do when something moved through her that was too large to fit in a single expression. She clapped until her palms stung. Later, after the ribbons were handed out, and Elijah had eaten 2 juice boxes and a granola bar and fallen asleep in the back seat, on the drive home, Diana sat in the parking garage of Texas Children's Hospital. She hadn't planned to stop there. She was already running 15 minutes late for an afternoon meeting at the Elijah Fund offices, a new intake process. Webb had submitted suggestions for 3 pages of reforms drafted from whatever he'd been reading during his 2-year suspension. She'd circled half of it in red pen, agreed with the other half more than she expected. But she'd parked here anyway. The garage smelled like exhaust and concrete, and the faint antiseptic that seemed to seep through every wall of the building above her. She sat for a moment without moving her hands, resting in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. 6 months ago, she had stood in floodwater on Bel Air Boulevard with a medical transport case pressed against her chest, telling herself to keep moving one more block. She hadn't known if any of it would matter. She hadn't known if the heart would survive the transfer, or if Elijah would survive the surgery, or if anything she'd done with that small, red USB drive would amount to more than a digital file that disappeared into some federal archive and changed nothing. She knew now. 847 files reviewed. 43 cases fast-tracked under the new emergency escalation protocol. Tyler Whitmore's surgery completed 5 weeks ago. Sarah had sent a photo of him holding a soccer ball in a hospital corridor, grinning the same way Elijah had grinned at the finish line. The Elijah Fund had already covered 11 families who couldn't otherwise afford the process. Raymond Cole had appeared before the oversight board, answered every question, and walked out of that room a man who no longer owed the past anything. Diana opened the car door and stepped out. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, not because she had a meeting there, but because the waiting room on 4 was where she'd first understood what it felt like to have no options left. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the rows of chairs, the low lighting the vending machine humming in the corner. A woman sat alone near the window, late 30s, hair pulled back, both hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. The particular stillness of someone who had been sitting in that chair long enough that stillness was all she had left. Diana walked over and sat down beside her. The woman glanced up, wary, the way people were when a stranger approached without an obvious reason. "I'm not staff," Diana said. "I'm not going to give you paperwork." She paused. "I just know what it looks like to sit in that chair." The woman's breath caught. She looked back at the window. "How long?" Diana asked. 11 weeks, the woman said. "His name is Marcus. He's 9. Diana nodded. She didn't offer reassurance. She didn't tell the woman it would be okay. She wasn't in the business of making promises the world wasn't qualified to keep. She just sat there, present and steady, in the same waiting room where Rosa had once handed her a cup of bad coffee and stayed without being asked. After a while, the woman exhaled long and slow, like something she'd been holding since before she even walked into the building. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sitting here. Someone did it for me once," Diana said. "I'm just passing it forward." She stayed until the woman's husband came out of the hallway looking for her. Then she stood, straightened her blazer, and walked back to the elevator. In the back seat of her car, Elijah's ribbon read second place. A small gold star, printed in the corner, sat on top of his backpack. Diana picked it up before she started the engine, turned it over once, set it back down. She pulled out of the garage into the last of the April light, heading home. Some stories don't end with a single moment. They end the way a storm does not, all at once, but gradually, the sky clearing from the edges inward until one morning you step outside and realize the air has changed. You're still the same person who stood in the rain. You just know now what you're capable of carrying. And sometimes that's enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who's sitting in that waiting room right now, holding a paper cup wondering if any of it will matter. It does.